This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library
enough, you can get the Truefire All Access Pass for as cheap as they ever do it, the $99 thing. So just jump and do that if you're looking for the best price that you can get Truefire All Access for.
Because I think probably most of you watching this have lived through this sort of explosion of digital modelling gear, amp modelers and that sort of stuff. I think it's, in some ways, kind of feels like the answer has always been use an FRFR speaker, whatever that is. That actually, it's not quite as recent as that. I think it's like 2016-ish is when you start to see an explosion of these kind of things. FRFR at this point, I think, is kind of considered like the first solution that anyone sort of comes up with, and the typical sort of names that you see are things like headrush. So if you Google headrush, it's one of the most common sort of search terms around FRFR. The Powercab was, as far as I can tell, like the first of the big companies to make their own version of this sort of thing from line 6. The Friedman was quite early on, like a bit of a boutique version of this sort of thing, like a more expensive, good-looking thing. There's, of course, also been like these more PA speakerish type things that are maybe a little bit more like a monitor wedge from each of those sort of just normal PA companies and that sort of stuff. And up until recently, with the Fender FR12, which I think is sort of, to me, one of the best solutions out there. I did see a review, I think it was Guitar World, where they said that having the EQ on it made it not a true FRFR. And I got a chance to sort of test quite an expensive, sort of over £1,000 sort of boutique made FRFR thing. And I've kind of come to the conclusion, for me personally, like, I'm not sure that FRFR is necessarily always the solution that you're going to be looking for. So in this footage here, just using the effects loop of a tube amp. If you've got a tube amp with an effects loop, I think they tried this on Anderton's the other day. I had someone send me a message like, have you seen this yet? I haven't watched the video, but I think they sort of did a shootout with some of these different solutions. You might not even need to buy an FRFR, essentially. If I go back to how I was first using a Line 6 Pod XT Live, I was actually using it in 4 cable method with an amp. And I do wonder if this is something that many other people have tried. I think in terms of convenience, the 4 cable method thing is one of the more tricky things to set up and all that sort of stuff. So I think initially the idea with the amp modeler and that sort of stuff is that it's going to be more convenient and maybe have to take less stuff to a gig. However, I think if you still want a bit of stage volume, then you're then going to have to think, right, what am I going to use? What I've still got is the ToneX cab, so they sent me one of those last year. I've really enjoyed that one. I would say that the Fender FR12, in terms of bang for buck, I think is probably my favourite of these solutions because it's like under £500. The ToneX cab is a little bit more than that. But I think the idea that I liked about the Fender FR12 was that it's kind of more just like an amp cabinet and like a proper cabinet. I like the fact that it's got those tilt back legs on it. And then the other thing I like on it is that actually, so this is one of the things with some of the other solutions where it's just like plugging straight into the thing, and it's like, well, what you get is what you're going to get. Actually, I found, so I was doing this gig with this other device that I won't name because I didn't have a great time with it. And it was like, well, the volume for it was like tucked away back inside the cab. So I was like, well, that's tricky to actually get the volume adjusted correctly anyway. So that was a problem. The other thing is that it has, well, this thing had a tweeter in it. And I think actually the tweeter is a little bit of the culprit to a lot of this stuff. So a normal guitar speaker, they can create loads of high-end sort of, 4K, 8K, all that sort of stuff. But what they don't have is a little buzz generator. So like an actual tweeter in a PA speaker or on your other speakers, if you hear just those, it's quite a piercing sort of tone, right? And that, I think, is what we're trying to get rid of with digital amps in general. So what I'd look for in any sort of FRFR solution would be, A, is it kind of built somewhat like a normal guitar speaker? If it's totally different, then to me, you might as well get something that's a bit more like a PA speaker. And although there is this idea that what's coming out of the front of the house PA and what's coming out of your FRFR should be the same thing, I think that's actually a bit of a misnomer. If you imagine like you had a real amp behind you with a mic, what's coming out of the PA is not going to sound exactly the same as your amp. Those things don't need to sound the same. I sort of believe that more complex and more full tone is actually going to be a blend of both of those things. And if those things are slightly different, you're actually probably going to get a bigger sort of sound, I think. So if you want it to sound exactly like PA speakers, then just use a PA speaker. Like they're good. So like Yamaha DXRs are decent, QSC are decent, RCF are decent. The Headrush is probably decent enough. Some Mackie stuff. But I don't think that is actually what a lot of guitarists are really wanting. I think once you bring an FRFR back on stage, you're thinking, right, I want it to be a little bit more like that amp in the room thing. So the things that I found work best is things that you can turn the tweeter off, or at least dial it out. So the Fender FR12 I really like because it's just convenient and easy to make tweaks. It's also this notion that, with modeling, you don't really need to tweak for the room. As soon as you put a speaker back in the room, you're probably going to find that some rooms are very boomy, or some rooms are not so boomy, or some rooms it's like, well, things sound a bit thin. Wherever you're placed in the room is going to matter. So I think having an EQ on the thing is pretty much, if you've got it there, you'll probably use it, is what I would say. So if you're finding, like last night I was in a fairly boomy room, if I'd had my ToneX cab with me, Lewis has got it, I would have dialed back the bass a bit because it was a bit boomy. Yes, so those are things that I'd look for. The ToneX cab also has this kind of setting where you can go between mic and live, and what that essentially does is sort of changes the mid-range a bit. And actually, I find that really useful as well. So I think the FRFR thing, totally flat across the whole spectrum, I think it's pretty much bollocks. You're putting this on a stage because you want it to sound, again, like you've brought an amp, I think, with you. So something that is totally flat across the whole spectrum, I don't think is necessarily what you want. You probably want something that has plenty of volume or headroom. You probably want something where you can tweak it for the room. And you probably want something that's not sounding super spiky or super bright. In my opinion, that's what I'm looking for anyway. So those are the things that I found work quite well. The Fender FR12 or the ToneX cab. Not the most expensive, not the cheapest, but I think those are pretty decent. The Line 6 Powercab, to me, overcomplicates things a bit. It's got a tweeter in there, which you can turn off, but it's got menus and it's got bits and pieces. And they're quite expensive. I would also say that if you're going down the route, like, there's no reason that you shouldn't necessarily try these things with like 2 speakers, or I think Laney even made a 4-speaker one. Laney as well, I think they've got a very well respected LFR solution. Is that what it's called, LFR? It's a full range flat response thing. The only thing is that doesn't have like a straightforward EQ on it, and it's quite a heavy thing anyway. But yes, the Powercab is not constructed exactly the same as like a normal guitar speaker, and also, yeah, has some menus and bits and pieces. I thought it was slightly overcomplicated. The ToneX cab can load IRs, which to me is, again, like a thing that I don't think I'll use, but in general, use is just plug and play. Now, I would also say in this video here, what you've been hearing was me just plugged into the tube power amp of the Black Cat 30. I think like a quality tube amp is going to have probably better on average cabinet building and better speakers than most of these solutions anyway. I think you won't have the tweeter, so you don't have to solve for that. And I've also found that you don't really, in my experience, need to turn off the IRs. I'll show you some of that now, but if you do already have a tube amp and you're considering, do I need an FRFR? I would say you could try this first, maybe, because it's going to be about the same size. You know, these things are fairly bulky. The thing that the most FRFR speakers have in their favour is they'll be slightly lighter because they're going to be Class D sort of solid state power and probably slightly lighter construction. You won't have all the tubes and stuff and that, but yeah, I think it's worth giving it a try just in terms of like redundancy. And then the next kind of point would be, well, if you're bringing that amp along anyway, then I think the next logical step might be that you end up going, well, I could just use this in a hybrid setup. If it's there on stage with you, wouldn't you probably use it as an amp? That's kind of what I found anyway.
So if you've got an amp which has an effects loop, FM9, I've just plugged straight in. I've not taken the cabs off or anything. All that's going on is just, it is what it is. So guitar in. If I was to take off the cab block, very bright. If I put it back on, it gets a little bit on the darker side. Now, another thing I could do in here, I think, is turn off the power amp modelling. So it definitely has plenty of volume. Plenty of volume. Definitely, I think when you try this, you might find, is there a ground loop on that? Possibly. But you might find that satisfying. Yeah, for me, a really satisfying experience. So if you've got an amp with an effects loop, just give this a try before you think, do I need to spend more money on an FRFR? I think big FRFR have sort of maybe got ahead of themselves, because I think this is a totally valid way to be running your stuff. You don't even need to turn the IRs off, in my opinion. Yeah, it might need a tiny bit of EQ maybe, but even right now I'm thinking like that sounds as good and as enjoyable to play as any FRFR I've ever tried. And I didn't know if this would work, but it did. So there you go, try it. Especially on the fractal stuff as well, where you can turn off that power amp modelling, gives you more of what you want.
But yeah, I would encourage you. The Fender FR12, I think, to me, is about as good as it gets for the money. ToneX cab is what I'm using. I'm really happy using both of those solutions live versus an actual amp. Some of the others I've had much less sort of pleasure and success with. So those are the ones that I would recommend. If you're thinking you need an FRFR, you might not. Tube amp might be the way to go sometimes. I don't know.